this evening representing the Lowell Institute. As has been noted, when John Lowell died in 1836, he left money under his will to establish a permanent charitable trust to fund free public lectures open to all in the city of Oslo. In a letter to his brother, John Lowell stated that public lectures are important because, quote, the prosperity of my native land, New England, which is sterile and unproductive, depends upon the intelligence and information of its inhabitants. Unquote. The first Lowell lecture was delivered in 1839, and over the years, the trustees of the Lowell Institute have founded and continue to support such notable projects as the Harvard Extension School, the Lowell Institute School at Northeastern University, and WGBH, Boston's public television station. Today, the Lowell Institute continues to sponsor free public lectures by partnering with over 20 cultural and educational organizations in Greater Boston. We also fund the WGBH Forum, which makes these lectures available online and free of charge for everyone, including this lecture tonight. It is particularly fitting that tonight's Lowell lecture is here in Marsh Chapel. Theology was very important to John Lowell. In his words, quote, the most important part of true philosophy is that which shows the connection between God's revelations and the knowledge of good and evil imparted by him in our nature. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to sponsor tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight I'm afforded one of the greatest privileges ever to come to a teacher, which is to be able to welcome a former student many years later after his wonderful ministry and career is coming to fullness, and to still just be here alive to welcome him. But the Reverend Cornell William Brooks, Esquire, was always a special person and is still a special person. He has devoted his life to social justice. He always refused to separate the spiritual from the social. He refused to compartmentalize people into just a head and our body or our spirit. And so when he came to the BU School of Theology as a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar, he studied social ethics and he studied philosophy, and he exhibited the traits then that have now led him to the great position that he holds today. After leaving the BU School of Theology, Reverend Brooks went to Yale Law School, where he excelled as a lawyer, as senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and a member of the Yale Law and Policy Review. He then served his clerkship with Chief Judge Sam Irvin, III on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. So Reverend Brooks traveled the difficult road of both being a fourth-generation ordained AME minister and being a lawyer who worked out of the nation's capital. In his work as a lawyer, he accomplished many things. He led the Newark-based New Jersey Institute for Social Justice as president and CEO. And there he directed the Institute's successful efforts to win the passage of 3 landmark prisoner re-entry bills in 2010 that created a more level playing field for individuals returning home following incarceration. As part of the Institute's Equal Justice Legal Initiative, and putting himself out there at the edge of social justice initiatives. And in doing so, he did this as a minister and as a man of faith and a man of God. It is my great honor then to be able to introduce to you the Reverend Cornell William Brooks, Esquire, as the Chief Executive, the President and CEO of the NAACP, the nation's oldest, largest, and most widely respected grassroots-based civil rights organization. So please join me in welcoming the Reverend Cornell William Brooks.
It would probably be the appropriate thing to do to be cool about this extraordinary opportunity, but I can't. I'm extraordinarily humbled to be in this place, to stand in this pulpit where decades ago I delivered my first sermon in ministry. And a few of my friends from 9092 Bay State Road, who, in support of my ministry, my roommate, Michael Cousin, who's the son of prominent Andy Bishop, all threatened to bring pillows and blankets to greet the occasion, as in catching up with their rest. It is extraordinary to be here, to be in the presence of a mentor, a friend, and Professor Robert, who was so instrumental in my growth and my development as a student and as a social justice advocate, and who was responsible for me leaving the country for the first time, being exposed to mission, missiology, and social justice on the global stage. It's an honor for me to be in the presence of a transformative being for those of us who have kept up with the work of the School of Theology for these many years. We're so delighted, we're so impressed, so in awe of your leadership and the fact that you're doing what you are doing with the faculty, with the staff, and with these extraordinary students. It's a great pleasure to be in the presence of my former classmate, Reverend Sheila Newsom, who was responsible for me being here last at your wedding. It's so wonderful to be in the presence of these students who really represent not only the legacy but the future of the School of Theology. I'm here in debt to so many professors. Dr. Howard Beck, Dr. Robert, Professor, I should say, administrators like Reverend Earl Bean, who's really responsible for me being here in the first place. So I just want to say thank you to you all. Now, as a fourth generation ordained minister and a trial lawyer, I'm called upon on occasion to share a few words. But I've not always had the occasion to be in the presence of so many distinguished people for such an august occasion as the Lowell lecture. I can think of a time when early in my ministry I found myself in London, England, true story, on a Sunday morning, standing outside this beautiful Gothic cathedral, where there were these beautiful spires soaring up toward the heavens, beautiful, multifaceted, multicolored, multi-hued, stained glass windows reflecting the iridescent beauty of God. And on a Sunday morning, I stood on the sidewalk and 2000 with sincerity, with conviction, with a rigor in terms of scholarship, a personal authenticity and transparency. And so as I was preaching, I immediately noticed the obvious, that Miss Jones immediately fell asleep. True story. But as I was preaching, I immediately noticed that Miss Smith seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. She nodded her head, she tapped her foot, she said amen, hallelujah, and praise the Lord. And I thought to myself, at least I'm reaching one somebody this Sunday morning. But as I concluded my little homily, made my way over to the pastor said to me, Brother Brooks, I'm so sorry. Miss Jones, she falls asleep on everybody. And Miss Smith, she's out of her mind and did not understand the thing you had to say. So on the occasion of this little lecture, you can imagine how delighted I am to be in the presence of such an august body, all wide awake and presumably in your right mind. It is my task this evening to speak for a few moments on transformational leadership. And when I think about transformational leadership, I think about a reservoir of transformational leaders who represent the legacy of the NAACP. I think about the first day in my new role as President and CEO of the nation's largest, oldest, most recognized grassroots civil rights organization. I think about the weight of history that I felt upon my shoulders, the overwhelming sense of responsibility, the sweeping sense of humility, being in the presence of so many powerful leaders, known and unknown. Walking into the national headquarters of the NAACP on that very first day, I was struck by the fact that this building is literally furnished and appointed with American ideals and American history. Every room is filled with certain captivating and powerful and compelling images. Images of our ideals and our history in motion and in action. Images of a woman with a shy countenance, yet masking a fierce determination. Her name was Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks. Some water. Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks, walking the corridors of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, my soul was stilled, my conscience was stirred by the image of a young minister with a precocious sense of moral maturity and a ministerial bearing by the name of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Walking the halls, I couldn't help but notice the bust of a ruggedly handsome man whose face literally reflected the depth of his courage. His name was Medgar Evers, a modern-day martyr. Walking the halls of the NAACP, I could not help but recognize and appreciate the photograph of a young man with his hands in the air. This young man, this boy of about 12 years old, was not photographed in Ferguson. He was photographed in Florida. He was not protesting the death of Mike Brown in Missouri, but rather protesting the death of Trayvon Martin in Florida. Walking the halls of the NAACP, I cannot help but be moved by the history literally on the walls. Transformative by images. So much so that we as a digital generation try to capture ourselves in pixels. We hold our iPhones, our mobile devices at arm's length and capture ourselves with selfies or pixelated self-portraits. And yet tonight, in the midst of this Lowell lecture, my moral curiosity prompts me to ask the question, what would happen if we held a cell phone of conscience at arm's length and took a selfie of social justice? What would happen if we took a selfie of social justice? What would happen if we took a selfie of America? What would happen if we took a selfie of these United States of America? What would happen if we took a selfie of Massachusetts? What would happen if we took a selfie of the NAACP? What would happen if we took a selfie of the nation? I believe that if you took a selfie of social justice, you might caption these pictures, these photographs, these portraits of contemporary America thusly. You might capture one photograph, income inequality. You might capture another photograph, criminal justice. And you might capture one photograph, voting rights. And the last photograph you might capture and entitle A Vision for America. And in each photograph, if you look closely, if you're morally discerning, you will find transformational leaders. Leaders that speak to us from the past, and leaders who yet speak to us now. Will you take a selfie of social justice, captioning criminal justice? You might find a multi-hued, multi-ethnic, multi-racial mosaic of desperation, representing 2.3 million Americans behind bars, a quintupling of the incarceration rate over a generation, 65 million Americans with criminal records, 1 out of every 4 adults, 1 out of every 3 young people being arrested by the age of 23. You might find in that picture millions of Americans who have been racially profiled, and according to the Justice Department and Amnesty International, a picture so large, so sweeping, that it represents the population of the nation of Canada in these United States. If you took a selfie of social justice, you would find buried in the catacombs, in the bowels of our criminal justice system, our children, black, brown, white, literally buried and thrown away as though they were the disposable children of God. But if you look at that picture closely, you will note transformational leaders. I can think of 2 such leaders whose pictures were found in a file cabinet roughly 50 years after they generated criminal records. There's a picture of a woman who's bespectacled and beautiful, fierce and determined. And yet beneath her picture are a series of numbers. There's another picture of a young man who, while youthful, reflected a sense of prophetic maturity. Beneath his picture are a series of numbers. We do not know the young man and the somewhat older woman by their criminal records, by their mugshots, found nearly 50 years after they engaged in civil disobedience in Montgomery, Alabama. We know the young man by the name of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We know the somewhat older woman, not by her mugshot number. School children all over the world their character, their reputation, and their bodies on the line. Transformational leaders do not merely possess moral courage, there's a physicality to their courage. In other words, it's not enough to say what we believe, we have to put our bodies where our beliefs are. It's not enough to preach our theology, to pronounce our theology, we have to embody our theology. We have to physically represent our theology. Sometimes, in this life, we're not called upon to place our bodies in sacrifice. And sometimes we're tempted to think that we're not being called upon to be courageous. But I'd like to suggest to you tonight that moving one's lips when you're tempted to keep them closed, shut, and silent can be an act of physical courage. Standing up when you would rather sit down can be an act of physical courage. I'm reminded of a transformational leader by the name of Medgar Evers, the field secretary in the state of Mississippi at the height of Jim Crowism and the very depths of our democracy gone awry. I recall Medgar Evers, as the history books tell us, as he lay dying, his last words being these: "Set me up and let me loose." There are moments in life when fear, trepidation, anxiety, cowardice have us wrapped up, bound up, and held down. In those moments, we have to say to ourselves, say to our churches, say to our community, say to the world, "Set me up, let me loose." If we are to be transformational leaders, we have to be not only morally courageous, but physically and bodily courageous. Our criminal justice system calls for that kind of courage. Where we have young men in some of our communities whose character and careers are stained and stigmatized by a criminal record. No matter how nonviolent, no matter how no long ago, they find themselves running a gauntlet of collateral sanctions, otherwise known as the penalty one pays for having a criminal record. A Supreme Court justice described it this way. He said that no one should face a life sentence of unemployment as a consequence of having served their time. Where we have young men who have served their time, paid their debt to society, whose skin is black, and when they check the box at the end of an employment application that poses a seemingly innocuous question, have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime? And when you check the box in the affirmative, if you're black, your chances of getting a callback at an interview or any follow-up decreases by 75%. And if you're a white male, your chance of getting a callback, an interview, or any follow-up decreases by 50%. And where you have, in certain instances, white males with a criminal record having a better chance of getting a job than a black man without a criminal record, we have a profound racial and criminal justice challenge. This is a place and a space where we need courage. The courage of our convictions, the courage to stand with those who are stigmatized, stand with those who wear a scarlet letter of banishment in our society, stand with those who are our brothers, our sisters, our siblings in the kingdom of God. We have to stand. It's not enough to say that this problem is a problem for them. When we consider the fact that 1 out of every 3 young people will have an arrest record, this is a problem for us. And so, we as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People have taken a strong stand on banning the box on employment applications. Why? Because we believe it's important for people to work. We believe it's important to support legislation that gives people a second chance. We believe that such legislation is predicated and premised on the moral proposition that if a man has paid his debt to society with the hard currency of responsibility, he deserves a second chance, particularly if he never had much of a first chance. Courage. The courage to walk counter to the conventional wisdom that assumes that certain people make mistakes, other people don't make mistakes. Courage to walk with people who are not wearing blue pinstripe suits, but who in fact wear orange jumpsuits. The courage to walk with and stand beside young people who are literally cast away as disposable children in our society. Courage to put your arms around someone who looks different, who lives in a different community, who's had a different set of experiences. Courage to physically be present and to morally be present. Courage. If you took a selfie of social justice and you captioned it voting rights. In this last election, news commentators have noted that there's been exchange of power in the U.S. Senate. They noted widely and well that one party won and the other party lost. Not noted widely and not noted particularly well is the fact that 2/3 of Americans did not participate in the process. Not noted well and widely enough is the fact that in the wake of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, we have all manner of state legislatures who have engaged in a Machiavellian manic frenzy of disenfranchisement, where we have state legislatures, as soon as the decision came down, working near overtime to keep young people from voting, to keep Latinos from voting, to keep African Americans from voting, to keep people with disabilities from voting, to keep the elderly from voting. There's something profoundly wrong and wrong-headed, constitutionally and morally speaking, about this movement toward disenfranchisement after the Reconstruction. Consider this. In the state of Texas, an ID that allows you to carry a concealed weapon is considered civically and democratically sufficient to empower one to vote. But an ID that allows you to carry a book of Shakespeare, a book of the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, a book of poetry, a book of chemistry, a college textbook is not. Or in this great state of North Carolina, an ID which allows you to walk across a college campus is democratically and civically insufficient a form of ID to allow you to vote, while an ID that allows you to walk across a military base is. When early voting was populated by people who are older, more conservative, and more likely to vote for one party rather than the other, early voting was a good thing. But as the ranks of early voters became populated by people who were younger and black and brown, it was deemed to be an insufficiently good thing and in fact a bad thing. So here we find ourselves after 2 historic elections where young people participated in the democratic process at unprecedented levels, and African Americans participated democratic process at unprecedented and historical levels, and after the election and re-election of America's first African-American president, we find ourselves in the midst of a season of disenfranchisement. We have to ask ourselves, what's wrong with this picture? If we turn the gilded pages of the history of the NAACP, we find transformational leaders who understand the importance of the franchise. We look at Medgar Evers. We look at Martin Luther King. We look at Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. And here I'd like to lift up one element of transformational leadership that I believe speaks to a theological community, though derived from a lawyer. Thurgood Marshall, as you know, won 29 of 32 cases in the Supreme Court. As you know, he applied to the University of Maryland Law School and was refused admission. As you know, he then applied to Howard University Law School, was admitted. As you know, he came under the tutelage of a lawyer by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston. As you know, Charles Hamilton Houston was an Army officer in World War I. As you know, Charles Hamilton Houston graduated from Amherst as an African-American Phi Beta Kappa, was the first, one of the first black editors of the Harvard Law Review decades before Barack Obama. As you know, when he went to Howard University, he was not given the title dean. He was not given a prestigious and palatial office. When he set up Howard University as a citadel of civil rights, and when Thurgood Marshall was admitted to that law school, his class was told, turn to your left, turn to your right. One of you will not be here by the end of the semester. One of the cardinal marks of leadership, transformational leaders, must be an exacting standard. Too often, prophets demand too little of themselves and too little of others. If we're going to be good lawyers, if we're going to be good ministers, if we're going to be good leaders, we have to ask much of ourselves and much of others. And the only way to do that is by leading by example, working harder, working smarter, working with a high sense of sacrifice and dedication, and modeling and emulating for the people you claim to lead the very values you say you hold. Charles Hamilton Houston did that. He did not live to see the fruit of his labors, but his student, Thurgood Marshall, helped bring that fruit into being. And for those of you who are students, you would do well to look at your professors and say to them, I represent your legacy. I represent the fruit that you're trying to harvest. And in my ministry, in my career, in my vocation, I want to bring this fruit to harvest. I have to say to you, sitting under the preaching of Harold Beck, sitting under the tutelage of theologians far greater than I could ever hope to be, sitting under the teaching of extraordinary professors who dedicated much and gave me much, I have to admit to you that I walked away hoping, praying that I could be a fraction of what they represented to me. We, as students, as members of this Boston University School of Theology, have this incredible legacy. It weighs upon us. When Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King and the Boston Persons are part of your legacy, they don't represent your alumni bragging rights. They represent the prophetic tradition that you're called to serve and represent. When I was here, I used to pose to myself this question. If our foremothers and forefathers and forebears did all they did with what little they had, why can we do more with all we have been given? When I think about it, the people who preached here, the people who have taught here, the people who represented the prophetic tradition at Boston University School of Theology. Every day that inspires me, calls out to me, and reminds me I have to adhere to an exacting standard of service, an exacting standard of scholarship, an exacting standard of service, an exacting standard of prayer and devotion. Another hallmark of transformational leaders, best represented by another figure, transformational leader in the Boston University tradition, that would be Howard Thurman, who linked inner and outer. And if I could be forgiven for an autobiographical note, one of the things I've noticed over the years is that it is exceedingly difficult to inspire people, exceedingly difficult to get them to follow you, exceedingly difficult to get them to sacrifice unless you're speaking, preaching, leading, serving from the depths of your soul. And you can't do that unless you're on your knees. You can't do that unless you're drawing from the wellspring of Scripture. You can't do that unless there's something there. You can't draw from an empty well. You can't lead from an empty space. You've got to stand in hours of prayer, hours of reading Scripture, hours of being in community, hours of being in fellowship, hours, days, and years of devotion. Let me give you an example. It's so important in our respective ministries to have a consistency and continuity of service that has a lot to do with what's on the inside. We know of Rosa Parks because of her heroic stand, I should say heroic stand by sitting down on a bus in Lowell. What we know less about is the fact that 10 years previously when she found out about an African American woman who was gang raped by a car full of white racists. 10 years before, decades before, we understood that when you interview, when you try to respond to a victim of sexual violence, when you respond to a woman who's been sexually traumatized, it's good to have a woman intervene. A decade before the Montgomery boycott, there was a criminal investigator working on behalf of the NAACP who went to visit a woman by the name of Miss Gracie Taylor. She interviewed her, created a committee to represent her. The point being this: Rosa Parks did not suddenly become the Rosa Parks of history, the mother of the modern civil rights movement, on the day she refused to give up her seat. She was Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks for years on end. The point being here is that we have to have a consistency and continuity of service, and that comes from a wellspring of devotion. If there were a selfie entitled Income Inequality, we might note that in the wake of the deindustrialization of American cities, we might note that in the wake of the suburbanization of poverty, we might note in the wake of the feminization of poverty, we might note in the midst of this uneven, uncertain economic recovery, we find that there are the 99% who found themselves on a creepy down escalator descending into full-time work, full-time aspiration, full-time ambitions on a part-time salary. And we find a 1% ever escalating on a high-speed elevator into luxury living in the same economy. It's important for us to understand that we as a society have to support not a minimum wage, but a minimum wage that's in fact a living wage, and a living wage that operates in the context of a living economy. Why? Because there is a relationship between work and worth. In other words, jobs represent not only dollars, but King, when he went to Memphis, he met sanitation workers wearing placards, sandwich signs, yet declaring, "I am a man." Not I deserve so many dollars an hour, so many benefits. I am a man. I am a woman. I am a child of God. I have self-worth. I have self-dignity. I deserve to be recognized. And in this American economy, in this American democracy, we have to recognize work and work in the same way. Out of a deep and abiding love and respect for the individual. Transformation leaders who put their lives on the line. Dr. King, as you well know, was advised not to go to Memphis. There was no time to go to Memphis. Memphis was a diversion. Memphis was a distraction. Memphis was a side trip. It was not the main objective. But transformational leaders, prophetic leaders, find themselves like the Good Samaritan, being distracted, being called out of your way, being called from the conventional, the routine, and habit into places and into communities that need your help. Last self vision. The School of Theology is a place where vision, dreams are born. This place is where we craft and create a vision. I confess, reading Niebuhr, reading Gustavo Gutierrez, reading Cornel West, reading Dana Robb, listening to Harold Beck, my vision of what I wanted to do with my life, the sacrifices I wanted to make, was born here. Transformational leaders have vision. But not only do they have vision, they have the ability to communicate a vision. And in order to communicate a vision, it's important to have an understanding of text and context. Here's what I mean. When you leave this place and you go to congregations and communities that are more liberal, more conservative, ideologically and theologically different, it's important to understand text, to have a deep reverence for text. Why? Because when you understand and have a reverence for text, and you possess a brave hermeneutic, a courageous hermeneutic, such that you're able to reimagine, to reinvigorate text based upon a love for Scripture, and a love for the people, and a love for preaching, and a love for sharing, and a love for listening, you have power. It's not the kind of power that allows you to have sway over millions of people. It's the kind of power that allows people to connect with who you are, what you represent, and what you stand for. It allows you to paint a vision that's compelling and powerful. Simon Sinek, the writer, encourages us to always start with why. He notes that Martin Luther King's speech on the Mall is not remembered as the "I have a plan" speech. It is remembered and revered as the "I have a dream" speech. We are called to paint visions, to craft dreams, to move people, to inspire people, and to not be apologetic. Now we have to be multilingual. Let's be clear. When you're speaking to legislators, it's often helpful to speak in terms of cost-benefit analysis. When you're speaking to lawyers, it's important to speak in terms of precedent. It's important to speak to business people in terms of economics and externalities. But when it comes to moving people and creating movements, we have to understand that values are the lingua franca of political discourse. In other words, we have to talk in terms of right and wrong, our society should be like, the direction we should be going. We've got to inspire people. And too often, inspiration is relegated to the margins, as though the people will get to the promised land on their own. I'm reminded of another transformational leader who words might strike some as realpolitik in terms of power and structures. They really speak to American ideals. He said, "There is no progress without struggle. Those who profess a faith of freedom yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the sea without the roar of mighty waters. There can be no progress without struggle." Frederick Douglass spoke then and speaks to us now in terms of struggle. The unwillingness to give up or to give in. A commitment to pursuing justice no matter what till the very end. That's what we're called to do. And so when I walk the halls of the NAACP, the pictures, the portraits that I see on the walls are heroes and heroines who never gave up, who never gave in, who never gave over to despair or pessimism or to defeatism. When I walk the halls of the NAACP, I'm reminded day in and day out that I walk among those who believe and yet believe. And when I stand in this place, speaking from this pulpit, in the midst of this body of believers, in the midst of this cloud of witnesses, I yet believe. I believe in this tradition. I believe in these prophets. I believe in this school of theology. And I believe those things which we aspire to, those things which we hope for, those things which we dream of, those things which we envision, we will, through our God, bring to pass.
Now we have a time for questions and interacting with Reverend Brooks. And I would like to ask you to please introduce yourself. As part of our community, we need to know who we're talking to. So please introduce yourself when you ask a question.
My name is Hyun Chen, and thank you for your great lecture. How do you see yourself as a leader? How do you see yourself as a leader in the congregation or the church and also in your own organization? And how do you combine those two leaderships in different places?
Between the congregation and as a warrior. One of the things that I've learned as a lawyer is the skill and art of crafting arguments, drawing upon precedent, applying a constitutional hermeneutic, if you will. But one of the things I learned as a minister that I believe to be more effective is the ability to non-judgmentally listen. And I found that to be far more effective. Here's what I mean. As a trial lawyer, if you simply concentrate on how well the argument is crafted, but you don't know the people to whom you are speaking, the argument may be admired, but ultimately it's not persuasive. As ministers, as clergy, as people of faith, because we have a certain reverence for one another. And we start with the assumption that the other person has value, innate value, and there's a sense of promise and potential. You listen in a different way. So as a leader, one of the things I've had to learn over the years is to spend a lot more time listening. Listening for why people believe what they believe, why they hold the values that they have, even and most importantly, among those who claim to support your cause. Because one of the things that is really interesting is when you leave seminary and you go out to pastor a church, many of the things that you are taught here, extraordinarily valuable, very applicable, but only through the lens of engagement and relationship. Critically important. So my leadership style really is one of building coalitions through listening, preaching, speaking through listening, modeling through listening. In other words, those things which could set a good example, could be exemplary behavior for some people, are not for others. And so it's really important to pay a lot of attention to who you're trying to lead.
Thank you for sharing those words of inspiration. I have a question regarding it's an issue that is seen, you spoke about how many young men are incarcerated. What words would you say to a generation of young men who never had fathers? But yet again, they have to be or embody. They have to embody being a father for a young generation of other individuals who never have fathers. It's a scary place to be when you have to represent something you've never seen being modeled. Right? Thank you.
It's a good question. And if I could just lift the question above the plane of stereotype and generalization. So when we look at our country in 2014, and we go back several decades, a generation, to Patrick Moynihan's famous or infamously expressed concern about the rate of single parenthood in the African American community. The degree of fatherlessness that he expressed concern about among African Americans is now the floor for Americans of every hue and heritage. The point being here is this is not a sociological problem for them. It is a sociological and theological and moral challenge collectively for us. And so to the extent that we talk about how do young men model fatherhood when they've never seen it, one of the things that I would simply say is this: that in every community there are uncles, grandfathers, father figures, mentors who are available as moms. Our challenge becomes as men, if I can be biographical or autobiographical, our challenge is being willing to ask for help and being willing to ask, how does one father, how does one parent? And the reality is that those who've grown up with fathers, grown up with mothers, come out of Ozzie and Harriet two-parent households, they too need help in parenting. Those of us who have been parents and who are parents understand all too well that no one arrives at the task tabula rasa, and that everybody needs help. But it's really a matter of asking for it. And I would simply say, with respect to a generation who have not been adequately fathered or fathered at all, we're well able I believe we're well able to respond to this because we've got many good fathers. I spent 6.5 years in Newark working with young men coming out of prisons. And one of the things I found was people respond to respect. They respond to love. They respond to belief, wherever it comes from. And so if you as a man stand next to another man and who's 17 and you say, young man, they immediately straighten up. If as Howard Thurman said many years ago, when he was referred to as young gentleman, it had an effect on him. Likewise, when we greet our young men as young gentlemen, sir, never male or female. 2 words I've banished from my vocabulary. Those words refer to animals. We should refer to our children as young men, young women, boys, and girls.
Good evening. Mario Mendes, second-year student at School of Theology. As you know, words, phrases, slogans have power. In my opinion, 2 of the biggest stumbling blocks to comprehensive, compassionate immigration reform are 2 phrases that are thrown around in government, in society, and sometimes in churches. 2 phrases. Illegal immigrant and protect the borders first. So when I hear those phrases, I hear echoes of fear, echoes of xenophobia, echoes of racism, echoes of so many things. But they get thrown around by politicians, by leaders, by church leaders, by pastors, and by people in the pews. So my question to you is, what can people in the pews and what all of us can do and say to legislators, to politicians, to pastors, to number 1, start moving away from those phrases, and at the same time address the problem that we do not have compassionate, comprehensive immigration reform in this country.
So, yesterday, by happenstance, I had a meeting with the president regarding comprehensive immigration reform. What was encouraging to me was that he gets it, or at least my impression is that he gets it. But to go to your question about the nomenclature of exclusion, I think one of the ways in which we address this vocabulary of exclusion is, 1, by using words that are inclusive, that are redemptive, that are powerful, and then 2, by speaking truth to power, not merely in a prophetic sense, but in a sense of being factual, right? So when we look at the number of foreign-born Americans in 2014, if you look at the history, we're roughly where we were 100 years ago. So in other words, there's no wave of illegal immigrants storming the borders. If we look at the hard data, if we look at the economics, immigration is a net plus. So part of the challenge becomes getting up under, if you will, people's fears and apprehensions with the facts. But another part of this, and again, this goes to communications, understanding the values that people hold, what their apprehensions are, what their fears are, and speaking in code. And what I mean by that, I don't mean dog whistle politics and racial coding, but I'm saying there's a way in which, if we're going to talk about inclusion, if we're going to talk about bringing people together, we've got to really understand where people are coming from, what they're apprehensive about, and speak in culturally appropriate ways. I think so often we want to bring about an inclusive result, speaking in the terms among the already convinced, right? It's sort of like so often among good prophetic communities, we want to hold a revival with the unwashed, the unbaptized, and the unbelieving locked out of the church. I'm being rhetorical here, but the point being here is we've got to talk to people in real ways that encourage them to think about others as not the other. But a lot of that has to do with really rolling up your sleeves, talking to people, engaging. And I don't mean polling. I'm talking about spending 6.5 years in Newark working with gangs. You tend to learn this language works, this language doesn't. The American public's not unlike that.
You talked a lot about standing in solidarity with people in the margins, with people going through these different things and being bold and unapologetic about that. And as a future pastor, hopefully someday, my question is, how do we in our churches integrate these tough conversations about race and sexism and classism into our worship services? How do we do that? Being mindful of the fact that our different lived experiences have affected us and formed us differently, while still holding the people in our churches accountable and responsible for the condition that our society is in.
I wish I had a more elegant answer, but a lot of it's relational. And what I mean by that is, as I heard so many times in this place, that when you leave the School of Theology and you're called upon to preach, to counsel, you're able to do a lot more if you have deep, loving, respectful relationships with people. Which means sometimes hearing people express in exclusive ways, inclusive intentions. Having people use offensive language, though connotatively, though their denotative intent is inclusive. But it's relational. So in other words, your preaching and your counseling is much more likely to be heard if your bedside manner, if your pastoral counseling is thoughtful and sensitive and loving and caring and consistent. And that is true in terms of social justice advocacy. When you lobby a legislator and you take the time to sit down and have a conversation about where they're coming from, how their families are, when people oppose you vigorously and engage in all kinds of misconduct, bad politics, bad coalition building, Machiavellian behavior, if you can be loving and kind and respectful, even as you try to outwit them, outpersuade them, build a bigger, better, more resource coalition, you get more done. But building those relationships, incredibly important. Now that being said, the loyal opposition will continue to be loyal and in opposition. But you can get a lot more done by being relational.
Last question.
Art Howard, second year here at Boston University School of Theology. You talk a lot and you reflected a lot on the civil rights movement here in America. You referred back to that quite a few times. So I'm very interested in that narrative. And within the prophetic tradition here, the School of Theology, one of our professors really stresses remembering, retelling, and reflecting on our narratives in our lives and things that we have come through as a nation and as a people. But one of the pushback that I get within this course with the younger generation is that this remembering and this retelling this story is not helpful for this age because it has not produced any results. And so even in my time in Ferguson, there was a lot of pushback from the young people who really felt that to romanticize the civil rights movement is not helpful at all for fighting against systemic and institutional racism in this day. And so my question to you is, do you feel that that story is still good for us as we continue to fight against the forms of racism here in America today?
Great question. Let me give you a story to indicate the degree to which I hear what you're saying. When I was in Ferguson, maybe a month, 3 weeks ago, at St. Louis University, I spoke to a crowd on stage with Cornel West and about 15 or so, mainly clergy. all over the age of 35. I immediately noticed walking on stage that everybody in the audience was below the age of 25. Major disconnect. And it was the only time in my career as a lawyer and as a minister that I've been simultaneously heckled and had a standing ovation. It was a powerful moment. Here's why. When people don't feel heard, they won't hear your stories. And so where we have in Ferguson a group of young people who've not seen clergy go to jail, they've not seen older people go to jail, or they're not aware of it, or they feel like their story has been marginalized. And so to the extent that we're willing to engage, hear their stories, they're willing to hear our stories. It's not that the stories are irrelevant, it's that the stories are irrelevant outside the context of relationship and listening and engagement. So in Ferguson, what you see is the organized groups, ACLU, Amnesty International, Dream Defenders, in the main, organizing among themselves. Not totally, but in the main. And then you have these smaller, unaffiliated groups organizing, and you have certain class and generation divisions. But here's the reality. The young people in Ferguson are really making the same arguments that Julian Bond made with respect to Martin Luther King. Same arguments that the young people made in the 60s relative to the folks who were activists in the 50s. Same arguments that I made in the late 80s relative to my father in the ministry back then. It will be the same argument that you make, that every generation is geriatric and irrelevant, as long as it's the generation ahead of you. But the point being here is that we have to build real working coalitions among the people who claim to be on the same side. And so I wouldn't throw away the prophetic tradition. I wouldn't throw away the contemporary civil rights prophetic tradition. What I would do is we've got to infuse that tradition. So in other words, talk about Trayvon Martin. Talk about the protests there. Talk about the protests in New York City with Eric Garner. Talk about the protests against police brutality all across the country. Talk about racial profiling. And so my point being is talk about, engage, and listen. It's just critically important, because here's the reality. What I noticed in Ferguson, you got a generation of folks who execute brilliantly marches. The last time I was there, we had a march, 1,500 people at 4 o'clock in the morning. We arrive at St. Louis University, we're there, we sit down, we're ready for a sit-in, and somebody asks, well, what do we do now? No program, no policy reform, no agenda. Here's my point. When I came to this job, I reached out to C.T. Vivian and some of the older heads, as it were, in the civil rights movement, though I am 20, 30, 40 years younger. The point being here is build a relationship. The older prophets have a role too.
Thank you to our students and others in this group for asking penetrating questions. Thank you to you, Cornell, for responding with penetrating answers. And thank you for challenging all of us, holding us accountable to a legacy of spirit and justice, and a vision of spirit and justice, and the precious moment we have in between. Thank you so very much. We offer you a small token of our gratitude, but our hearts are overflowing and we don't have words